Bismillah.
Greetings and peace, everybody. Thank you all for joining me today. Today, I have the honor and privilege again of my friend and brother, Sheikh Wahid Azal from the Fatimiyya Sufi order, joining me for part 4 of these conversations that we're building. And today, our beloved Sheikh and friend is going to discuss about the recent events that are going on in Afghanistan. And from his analysis and the geopolitical scenario that's taking place, and it's very important that we get the analysis of Sheikh Wahid Azal because there's so much lies and misinformation that are being put out there. So I would start this with the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most beneficent, most merciful, and Nur alaikum to our beloved Sheikh on today's topic. And thank you for joining us.
Wa alaikum Nur, and thanks for having me on again. It's a privilege as always to be with you. Yeah, I'm noticing a lot of misinformation on the internet, whether on social media or on YouTube or elsewhere, about what is actually happening in Afghanistan, because this is not an easy narrative to untangle. What I will say, I mean, because this comparison is being made, they're comparing it to the Vietnam moment in Saigon in 1975 when the American troops withdrew. There are similarities. Let me put it to you this way. I'll use Nietzsche's metaphor of the eternal reoccurrence of the same. Yes, we have a Saigon moment, again, Saigon Mark II, but it isn't at the same time, because in Vietnam, Americans really did get their backsides handed to them on the military theater. Whereas here in the last 20 years, we're dealing with a much more complicated narrative than people understand. Particularly given the fact that the difference between Vietnam and the difference between Afghanistan is that in Vietnam, we had two powers that were solidly behind the Viet Cong and also the North Vietnamese government. You had the Soviet Union and you had the North Vietnamese government itself behind the Viet Cong. And also one could make the argument that engagement in that military situation in Indochina at the time was not actually meant to be won by the Americans. And for a very simple reason. You're talking about a period where nuclear war was a real possibility. And a victory by the United States in China would have immediately triggered a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States. So the point of that exercise was also not to actually win that engagement militarily on the ground. Even though you had 30,000 plus Americans being massacred, kids from average American families sending their kids to Vietnam and coming back in body bags. But this is a much more complicated and much more darker story than most people understand. And where we have to, I think, start with all of this is back in the late 1960s. And that is with a particular figure, an eminent Orientalist and historian by the name of Bernard Lewis. Bernard Lewis was a British Zionist. He was a lecturer at the School of Oriental and African Studies, incidentally, the very same place that hatched the 1953 coup d'etat against Mohammad Mossadegh. And in fact, the person who was responsible for that event was a colleague of Bernard Lewis, Anne Lambton. Bernard Lewis was the brainchild of a policy that the Anglo-American establishment adopted as a result of a paper that he gave at one of the meetings of the Council on Foreign Relations. I believe it was either in 1969 or 1970. The position paper that he gave was called the Green Belt Theory. And this was Bernard Lewis's strategy about how to ultimately take down the Soviet Union. And the Green Belt Theory basically proposed that the United States and its allies would actively begin cultivating Islamists throughout Central Asia and all of the Middle East with the help of the Saudis and with the help of some of their other allies then emerging at the time, like the Kuwaitis, the Qataris, and the Gulf kingdoms were still primitive at that point. And this is what they did. The first result of this Green Belt theory was seen in 1978-79 with the Iranian Islamic Revolution. This was one of the consequences of it. And one of the reasons why they weaponized this strategy against Iran was particularly because during the 1970s, the Shah of Iran started taking an independent line of the West on the question of oil. He was cultivating OPEC. OPEC was starting to become more independent. The Shah was proposing a kind of a block of oil-producing countries, independent of the interests of the West and the Western oil companies. So the first place where they weaponized Islamism as such, in that region was against Iran itself. They got the Shah out of the way, who incidentally was also developing his own relations with the Soviet Union, somewhat independent of the United States. Now, I'm no fan of the Pahlavis. I'm glad that dynasty left Iran. My entire family have always been supporters of Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh. My late grandfather was to the events of the premiership of Dr. Mossadegh. He had watched Dr. Mossadegh in the Iranian parliament during the 1950s. He was there. My grandfather was there when the oil nationalization bill was passed through the Iranian parliament in 1951. So my family were solid Mossadeghists, and I am myself to this very day. But we have to be fair. We have to assess history on the facts, and also then look at the trajectory of history in the way that it moves. And we see that the Shah himself was beginning to kind of adopt a Mossadeghist kind of angle to his policy in the 1970s. He was not very smart about this strategy. And so the West, and particularly the United States, Great Britain, and the European oil companies used the strategy of green belting against the Shah himself. This immediately created the situation where almost 9 months after the success of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, it forced the hand of the Soviet Union itself, following an internal coup d'etat of a puppet government that they were supporting at the time. It forced the hand of the Soviet Union in November 1979, almost identically in the same period when the American hostages were taken in the embassy in Tehran. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Initially, it was supposed to be in a sort of an expeditionary expedition into the Soviet Union to prop up the puppet socialist government of Afghanistan. It turned into a nearly 10-year quagmire for the USSR. And as a result of this, what the United States did, beginning with the Carter administration and beginning with a very key individual in the Carter administration, a Polish right-winger by the name of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is the author of what they call the Grand Chessboard. He's the guy that really tweaks the ideas of Henry Kissinger, 10 times beyond where it was before. And they begin to fund and arm through the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence service, and General Zia al-Haq, these various Islamist forces, composing them into what became the Afghan Mujahideen to fight the USSR and also the puppet government in Kabul. They sidelined the entirety of the secular opposition of Afghanistan, whether we're talking about left-wing, nationalists, or otherwise, the monarchists, people who wanted to see Zahir Shah come back, the king of Afghanistan who had been overthrown in 1973. So that is where all of this begins. And it begins with the United States. It begins with the ISI. It begins with General Zia al-Haq. This was the general, the Pakistani general, also connected to the ISI, who was responsible for the coup d'etat against Zulfikar Bhutto in 1978. This was a popular prime minister, the father of Benazir Bhutto, who was also assassinated, I believe, back in 2007 or 8. So all of this was meant for one thing at that time, was to basically encircle the Soviet Union and China and destabilize them using Islamist forces, the most radical elements. And the Taliban specifically is a Deobandi element of this. We had the Wahhabis coming from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, but we also had within that region of Southwest Asia or Southwest Central Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Barlavis and the Deobandis. These are elements that in the 19th century, the British Empire had actively cultivated against the then emerging nationalist forces under the British Raj. So the growth of Islamism, the cultivation of Islamism is very much a strategy that both the British and the Americans have very successfully been using against nationalist and independent-seeking political movements that seek, anti-imperialist lines and what have you. Incidentally, this was completely the playbook that they implemented in Iran, and it is to this very day. So we have the 1980s, we have these Afghan mujahideen, the most, extremist, straight-jacketed forms of Islamists fighting the Soviet Union with the arms, logistics, and training of the CIA and the United States government, and also various companies and interests around this sort of thing. And eventually they exhausted the Soviet Red Army and really gave it a shellacking on the ground. And let's remember, the Red Army is the same army that from 1941 to 1945, and especially from 1942 to 1945, destroyed the German war machine. So, whereas the West likes to take credit for winning the war against Hitler in Europe, the true forces on the ground that defeated the Nazi war machine were Stalin and the Red Army. It was not the Americans, it was not the Brits, it was not the French. Granted, the American Lend-Lease kind of provided the raw material and the funding and the arms and whatnot, but it was the Russians who really won that war. And yet, it was these Pashtuns, it was these Mujahideen, it was these CIA-trained Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan that defeated one of the mightiest militaries of the time and literally brought that superpower to its knees. And only 2 years later, after the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, the red flag went down from the Kremlin for the very last time, and Soviet Union ceased to exist as a result of the forces that were unleashed from that war in Afghanistan. Now, the analysis of a lot of punditry in retrospect is that entire war in Afghanistan was a trap that was laid for the Russians to come in, particularly hatched by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who again was a colleague of Bernard Lewis's. And through this facility, they brought not just pushed the Soviets out of Afghanistan and that part of Asia, but also brought the whole system in the USSR down eventually. Now, these policies don't have an end date. And so after the defeat of the Soviet Union, you have a period, particularly from around 1989 to about 1995, 1996, when the Taliban take over, where you have all these various Islamist factions fighting each other incessantly. There's just this endless civil war. You had one particular figure at the time that was supported by both Iran and the United States and was living in Iran at the time. This was Golbuddin Hekmatyar, a completely psychotic individual, Islamist, supported by Iran. He was living in Iran during most of the war in Afghanistan, and he espoused an extremist Salafist ideology. He was so extreme that he was even rejected by the Taliban, So then the Taliban comes out of the Pashtun tribes around that period, and very quickly, from around 1994 to 1996, just manages to take over the entirety of Afghanistan, other than the north, where you had the remaining forces of one of the great commanders of that Afghan-Soviet war, Ahmad Shah Massoud. He had his own militia and army known as the Northern Alliance. These were mainly very moderate, middle-of-the-road kind of Muslims. Ahmad Shah Massoud himself, he had connections to the Sufi orders of Afghanistan. It is rumored very strongly that he had ijazat. He had permissions from both the Qadri order of Afghanistan as well as the Naqshbandi order of Afghanistan. So we're getting very close now to our own period. The United States at the time, under the Clinton administration, looked upon the emergence of the Taliban with a lot of glee, particularly because immediately after the Taliban took Kabul, the first thing that they did is they marched into the Iranian embassy and murdered the diplomats in the Iranian embassy in Kabul. This almost brought the Taliban and Iran at the time to blows. Iran was threatening to invade Afghanistan at that point because of what it did to its diplomats. Clinton and the Clinton administration looked at this and were rubbing their hands. So they began to cultivate the Taliban very actively. There were American, both diplomatic on the diplomatic level and also on the obvious in the covert level of the CIA, and also companies, various American companies that were going to Afghanistan In 1998, only 2 years after the Taliban took Kabul, you had a contingency of these people that were brought to Texas to talk to various, of these oilmen, etc., about the prospects of both oil exploration, but also for this Caspian pipeline that the Americans were extremely interested in building, which they still haven't built, that would go through Tajikistan and Afghanistan and would basically give the pipeline control of that part of Southwest Asia completely to the United States. For some reason, which is still very murky as to the reasons why, Mullah Omar, who at the time was the supreme leader of the Taliban, rejected this, and also rejected. He had a very different line on the opium. This is something that the Americans were kind of hoping that the Taliban would do, that they would become the proxies of the United States and these American companies for the cultivation of opium in Afghanistan. Mullah Omar rejected this. And, Mullah Omar was a very, the Taliban ideology from the angle of fiqh, they're Hanafis, but the interpretations are extremist, are very puritanical. And Mullah Omar was not a cynical political player. So he just said, no, we're not dealing with this stuff. We don't need the money. We don't need any of this stuff, even though his own advisors were telling them that this was a good deal. And it was as a result of this that you see that only a few months after the second time the Taliban were brought to the United States under the George Bush administration in the summer of 2001. This is only about 3 or 4 months out from September 11th, where the Americans basically put their final ultimatum to the Taliban: come to the party. This is what we'll do for you. We will develop Afghanistan under you. You can literally become the second Saudi Arabia or the second Dubai overnight, and we will make the investment. You guys will be our people. And basically, the Taliban said no at the time. And 3 or 4 months later, you had September 11th happen. And the first thing that happened on the very day before September 11th, is that you had a so-called journalist, a fake journalist, infiltrating themselves into the camp of Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was at the time was making inroads against the Taliban. Ahmad Shah Massoud was a very independent, fiercely independent political actor. He was both anti-American and anti-Islamist simultaneously. But this journalist weaseled themselves into the camp of Ahmad Shah Massoud, and it turned out that this was a suicide bomber. And only one day before September 11th, Ahmad Shah Massoud was assassinated in his own camp. So right here, that there's a plan afoot, that the Americans wanted to eliminate this guy, first of all, to clear the deck, because their plan all along was to go into Afghanistan. Now, here's something what a lot of the punditry are not talking about. The dynamics of these sorts of events are always very seldom at the behest of actually governments. Governments, and this is what, unfortunately, a lot of the punditry don't understand about the nature of the world that we're living in, is that governments no longer are decision makers. Governments are props. Mm-hmm. It is interest groups, corporations, right? Big plutocrats from behind the scenes, etc. These are the real movers and shakers. These are the real policymakers, right? So the people who wanted to build the pipelines in Afghanistan, companies like, for example, Halliburton, or even Raytheon, for whatever reasons, or mineral exploration companies, oil exploration companies. These are the people who are writing the policies for the Bush administration at the time, and even now for the Biden administration before that with Trump, etc. So what governments are being used for are basically as the bouncers and the enforcers of the interests of these so-called plutocrats, companies, big interests. This is the nature of capitalism. This is how capitalism works. So when people rail against government, the American government is bad, the American government is this, American government, yes, they are, but the fact is that the American government itself is owned. So, you are railing against an entity that is owned, but not the actual owner. And this is where the analysis goes off. I mean, I have said this before, and I will say it again. living in a world where we have moved in the very opposite direction to what Karl Marx predicted would happen under communism.
Mhm.
He predicted that under communism, the state would wither away. I would say that the state has withered away under neoliberal capitalism completely. The state is now just a prop. It is corporations. It is the corporatocracy that is the true government. And the state, the social contract, doesn't exist. So when we make political and geopolitical analysis of events in the world, we have to analyze events from that perspective rather than look at what Biden is saying or what Putin is saying or what Xi is saying or what this leader is saying or what MBS is saying or what the Iranians are saying. Now, this is how ridiculous this entire situation in Afghanistan is because in 2016, at the height of the war in Syria and most of the Middle East against ISIS, right?
Mhm.
Iran and the Taliban all of a sudden out of nowhere become allies. And Iran begins to court and cultivate the Taliban. There are Taliban people that are coming to Iran on a regular basis. And then all of a sudden we hear about the falling out between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. The Taliban then, kind of cozy up to Qatar, open up an office in Doha, of all places, an official office not too far away from where the American fleet is stationed in Bahrain. And on and on and on these examples go. And so the question is, what is actually going on? Well, what is going on is that when you get behind, when you just completely look beyond the surface level of geopolitical events, what is going on are backroom deals. There are interests, money, capital is flowing, investment, projects, developments that are being looked at, by a variety of actors who may be embedding themselves in governments from behind the scenes, but it is these actors that we need to look at. So why is the Taliban suddenly becoming an actor again after years when the Americans had claimed they had destroyed the Taliban, when the Taliban had been made into a pariah, they had been equated with Al-Qaeda, they had been equated with the events of 9/11, but all of a sudden everything changes. The reason is because I would submit, and I have heard this from numerous Afghans themselves, is that the United States never came to Afghanistan to defeat the Taliban at all. And despite all the various war crimes that have been committed against the Afghan people by by the Americans, by the CIA, by these special ops, etc., the point was never to actually defeat and destroy the Taliban. Had the United States military wanted to, or had the instructions to do from the real masters, the Taliban would have been wiped off the face of the earth within the first month after the American invasion in 2001. But that was never the agenda. The agenda was to basically, first of all, to make money from arms dealing and narco traffic, right? Initially, the Taliban had rejected the American overtures to become their representatives of the opium trade in Afghanistan. Because of what happened in 2001 and the invasion of Afghanistan, the Taliban learned their lesson. So since 2001, and particularly since the death of Mullah Omar, I think around 2010, the Taliban have done a complete about-face on narco traffic. And today, the Taliban are one of the biggest narco traffic forces in that entire region. And we have the testimony of numerous Western journalists to this. So when people come and talk about how the Taliban rejected initially, and this is why they're trying to paint a picture of the Taliban as the good guys, now they're not. The Taliban are a cynical, almost religious mafia, if you would, that the Americans actively allowed to flourish during the last 20 years that they were there. And the end game was always going to be this, right? Now, the end game was supposed to unfold probably a little differently than what we have been seeing over the last week, because this, on the level of symbolism, this has really humiliated the United States because it does look like a second Saigon moment. But the people who are actually holding the strings from behind the scenes of this, the people who are actually making the money, the international arms dealers, the mineral explorer companies who have found all kinds of minerals in Afghanistan, and the people who eventually want to build these pipelines, they're rubbing their hands in glee because the Taliban now is going to be a force that's going to completely work with these people, right? They learned their lesson in 2001, right? Americans didn't eliminate them. They came back full force. And now they're going to be much more amenable to these forces than they were back then. And where does this leave the Afghan people? Well, this leaves the Afghan people is that they have a Deobandi extremist, Islamist regime now imposed on them by default, but with the addition that there's going to be a complete neoliberalization of Afghanistan. We also incidentally witnessed something very similar to this happen in Vietnam itself during the 1980s and 1990s.
Right.
Americans started going back to Vietnam in the late 1980s as the war in Afghanistan was winding down. The Soviets were retreating, and Soviet influence itself was beginning to crumble all throughout the part of Southeast Asia. All of a sudden, you have a trickle of Americans going into Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, etc. And from the 1990s onwards, you have this steady stream of investment. And today, Vietnam is a joke. It has become exactly the caricature of what it was in the 1960s when the Americans were there. You can look all of this up online on YouTube, where you have explosion of the prostitution again. You have an explosion of just the most decadent Western kind of paradigm that was operative back in the 1960s, completely opposite to what the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese originally intended. These were communists, they were Marxist Leninists. The same thing is about to happen in Afghanistan. Afghanistan's original Taliban leadership were probably very narrow-minded in the minds of these people, but the Taliban leadership of today, under this guy, Hibatullah Akhundzadeh, who's the emir and supreme leader of the Taliban now, they are a completely different creature than what they were 20 years ago. And a lot of people are not taking this into account. The Taliban haven't changed in violence. They haven't changed in their narrow-mindedness, but on many other levels, they have become much more cynical, much more worldly wise, much more hardened to the world. And this makes these people a lot more dangerous than what they were back in 2001. A lot of the punditry is not factoring in this. You're hearing this stuff that I'm saying to you from an assortment of journalists, Western journalists. There was one woman on the Australian ABC a couple of nights ago, and she basically said exactly what I'm saying right now. And she's been on the ground for the last couple of years in Afghanistan. You also hear this from a lot of Afghans, people who have families back in Afghanistan, who go back and forth, etc. Because I'm Iranian, and the official language of Afghanistan is Dari, I can talk to these people in their own language, and get information about what is happening in Afghanistan on the ground. So this is what we're dealing with. The other intention that I believe that the Americans have, because the Chinese at the moment seem to be under the impression that they can cut their own deal with the Taliban and get into Afghanistan, look at these minerals, the massive deposits of uranium and iron and ore and all kinds of things that these big companies are looking for, and possibly get in on the action on the ground first. I think that what the Americans think they are doing is that because the Taliban, in some sense, is now beholden to the United States, right? Because America has basically handed the entirety of Afghanistan back to the Taliban, right? Without a shot being fired, is that the Americans are basically going to use the Taliban for a upcoming rainy day against China and against its interests, not just in Afghanistan, but also against China and the Chinese Muslims themselves. This is like I said to you, this is an extremely tangled web of a story. I don't believe that this gamble that the Americans are doing is going to pay off. Why? Because I think the Chinese are going to be able to pay the Taliban a lot more than the Americans will. right? So this is the money game now. And this is what the Taliban are looking at. Who's going to pay us more money? you know, and whoever pays us more money will work with them, right? So this is where this is all headed. An extremely cynical, dark, but wheeling and dealing bazaar paradigm, right? This is the this is what I call the geopolitics of corporatocracy, right? Not the geopolitics of governments and what, foreign ministries and secretaries of state say, but what is really going on? What are the business, the interests in there? And who suffers through all of this? The Afghan people, the Afghan women, the Afghan children, the people who didn't manage to get out of Afghanistan. Now, the Taliban is certainly going to, at least the lower level Taliban fighters are certainly going to start taking revenge on, for example, these thousands of interpreters and translators that the Americans hired, or the various local contractors that they've had over the last 20 years. This is all going to happen. So, expect in very short order, a massive bloodletting in Afghanistan. But as anybody who's worldly wise understands very well, the West and the United States in particular have never cared one iota about human rights. Human rights is a weapon that they use against whatever government or force that they don't happen to like at any given time. Now that the Taliban appears to be one of their people, right? Expect to hear media blackouts, particularly in the next 6 or 7 months, about what is going on in Afghanistan. And this is what the situation is. So in a sense, no, this is not a defeat of the Americans, or at least it is not the defeat of American corporatocracy in Afghanistan. It may be a symbolic defeat of the American military and the American policy wonks of the Pentagon and the U.S. State Department, but it's definitely not a defeat of the corporates.
Yes, I agree completely, and you have laid it out in a very beautiful and articulate manner. And the truths that you are sharing, Sheikh, no other pundit or commentator or somebody from the so-called truth community is actually sharing. These are the truths. I'm from the Pakistan area, so I know all the history behind General Zia-ul-Haq and what happened at that time. So you have laid it out in a very good way that in order of what's going to take place, also our countries, Iran and Pakistan, we share the borders with Afghanistan. So geopolitically, that's going to affect everybody in that area in terms of the next 10 to 20 years, what's coming. And also with a lot of the opium that was coming from there to here. I know so many people here in the Philadelphia area, here on the East Coast of America, so many people that have died of overdoses, they're on drugs, they're on just so much insanity that I see going on. And I realize somebody's making money from this. They're just not they're not just there to uphold human rights or so-called human rights or protect democracy or etc. Somebody's making money somewhere, and there's a money trail that goes to these invisible masters where every other person in America either knows somebody that's hooked on opioids or they know somebody that's died or overdosed. So there is a connection that's there, just like with the movie American Gangster, that shows that these are American gangsters. That's who they are. And it's just basically, it's not about, on symbolically, it's exactly true that, okay, just make them feel good that they won the war and just have this aspect of us looking defeated, while in the next 10 to 20 years, they're just going to go and just pick everything up step by step. Like like how they gentrify minority neighborhoods in here in America, just make them look good, feel good, step by step, you just eradicate them one by one and you achieve your objective.
Here's an example that made me laugh when I first found out about it. Trump's wall, right? Do you know who one of the biggest non-American supporters of Trump's wall was?
That I don't know.
The Mexican mafia, Mexican drug cartels. They were over the moon over this idea, and we're very disappointed with the election of Joe Biden, who's effectively abandoned this project. Why? Because this project of Trump and stopping, the immigration through the borders, which is still being stopped, gives them more money, because then they have to, there are other ways that they have to charge people lots of money to get them over the border.
Mhm.
There's more kickback between the sides, between the American and the Mexican side. All of this is revenue, black revenue, but nevertheless revenue for these groups.
Of course.
Um, and this is what a lot of punditry, people who go on RT or Press TV or etc., don't really want to get into, because also the governments that run these networks, whether it's the Russians or the Iranians, don't want people talking about this sort of stuff, about the real dark underbelly of geopolitics.
That's
That is,
exactly right.
yeah, yeah,
And even in Pakistan, like there are still elements like with the ISI that plays like both sides of the game. While on one side they're collecting money from the Americans, and on the other side they're helping the so-called Mujahideen or these other fighters basically go against the Americans. And I remember back in 2010 or 11, they had this, like that's when a lot of the American soldiers were being targeted and killed during that
yeah.
time, especially in those summertime regions. And there had these websites where a lot of these analysts or these intelligence analysts would be saying that this is who we are, this is what we're doing. So they would tell you what they were doing and who they were for those that had the eyes to see it. And now we're going to see how this affects Pakistan too, because now you have a lot of these refugees trying to flow into the country, just like
Mm.
in the Soviet war when they had to accept like 2 to 3 million refugees. So they're already on the brink of an economic breakdown under the leadership of Imran Khan. So now we're gonna see how they're gonna get affected too, and how's Iran and how's China, and what's really gonna happen with these players within these next 10 years.
Well, I mean, from what I'm reading about the situation of Pakistan, is that both the ISI establishment, also certain elements of the West, don't like Imran Khan. And
Mhm.
Imran Khan is also incompetent in some ways. But what they want, see, the West is always happy when you have a general in control in Islamabad, or you have an Islamist in
Yeah.
control. One of these two. Imran Khan defies all these, even though Imran Khan himself is quite incompetent and doesn't know how to, hasn't been able to do what he claimed he was going to do. But ultimately, what this is starting to look at, like to me, is that there are interests that want to foment a Pakistani-Indian conflict,
Exactly.
um, and because this is going to make them a lot of money,
Hmm.
right? Meanwhile, they also think, although this also, like I said before, this remains to be seen, that they will foment the Taliban as a sort of a proxy army against China, and again, to foment the Chinese Muslims against Beijing. I don't believe this, I think this is a miscalculation on the part of the West, because the Chinese are extremely savvy,
Yes.
and they know how to even work with forces like the Taliban.
Hmm.
So I don't think that is going to go anywhere. But in all of this, you have the situation, for example, with Iran, who at the moment is going through every form of moral contortionism that you can imagine,
Hmm.
in trying to justify its gushing endorsement of the Taliban, and trying to example them as this force that defeated the empire, when nothing of the sort has happened. There's far more cynical narrative at play. And this makes one extremely sad, because there are a lot of good people out there in social media, whether in the West itself, or whether amongst groups of people that we know in Pakistan or Iran or elsewhere, who truly have faith in the system in Iran,
Yeah.
not realizing that the Iranians, and I'm speaking as an Iranian, um, the Iranians are as cynical, duplicitous as any other political force out there. And the evidence of this is everywhere that this is the case. So in a sense, the Iranians are also selling out the average Muslim in Afghanistan,
Hmm.
especially the Hazara Shias, because I don't believe for a second that, with all the guarantees that they may have given to the Iranians, that the Taliban can resist themselves when it comes to Hazara, right? And we saw what they did, to those Bamiyan Buddhas. We saw what they did to countless population of the Hazara Shia of Afghanistan. Whatever the Taliban say, at the end of the day, they are sworn enemies to the Hazara Shia of Afghanistan. And whatever Iran thinks, the Taliban isn't or is going to do, I think this is worthless at the end of the day, because you're dealing with criminals, essentially, is what the Taliban is. These are cutthroats, ideologically different, and at the same time cynical to the core, given what I just laid out for you. So the future and the prospects and the safety of the Hazara community in Afghanistan is in serious jeopardy. And the Americans basically sold them out, as did Iran, both of them.
And it's so unfortunate that now we're in the month of Muharram, and these events taking place in the month of Muharram on top of Ashura coming up soon, which a lot of my friends are also going to be participating in Karachi and in Pakistan with the Shia communities. So it's interesting to see how the synchronicity, especially with the Islamic calendar, and how these things are happening in Muharram and in the time of Ashura, the times that are known to basically strengthen one's faith in terms of trials and tribulations. So it's interesting with the synchronicity. And also one interesting thing I saw was the plane, that the viral video that's going around, the one where they had the Afghans on top of the wings.
Yeah.
That backwards, the numbers was 11-9. So that was basically not 9/11.
9/11
So they show the
backwards.
symbolism on the plane, and that's the video that went viral.
Yeah. And also the August 15th was the day that the British were basically sent packing out of Afghanistan in the 1840s. So there's a lot of symbolism right now with Afghanistan. This has been a reoccurring story with Afghanistan. I mean, it destroyed Alexander the Great only 7 years after he marched into Afghanistan. He lay dying in Babylon, poisoned by one of his wives. Happened to the British, happened to the USSR. Now, the fall of the American empire is I think, incidental ultimately to these plutocrats that we're talking about, because these people don't have borders.
Yes.
They have no loyalties to any country. They may use concepts such as nationalism and patriotism whenever it suits them, but at the end of the day, these people have only one loyalty, and that is to their pockets.
Yes.
And their portfolios and stock options, etc.
Well, these people are like, they're transnational mafias and criminals. They exist. It's like what we call the cultists of the kings of Edom. That's what they are. So together, they're all part of the cult, and they're identified behind different ideologies, names, identities, religions. And behind the scenes, they're all in on it together, which basically shows that even if they have to put the American empire on the sacrificial altar for them to make money, like just how, like you said, that 2 years after the Afghanistan debacle, the Soviets took the red flag down. So what's going to happen here with this, basically a civil war practically here between the people within the next 10 years? What's going to happen with the Pax Americana?
Pax Americana is dead. And I think officially, as of August, 12, 15, we can symbolically say that this is the end of the American empire in that form. What is going to transpire in America itself is not good. I foresee that over the next couple of years that you're going to have exactly the kind of scenario that you just mentioned transpire in the United States, more polarization, more, extremist forces. I think that you're going to see something on the order of a Trump Mark II. It may or may not be Donald Trump. This is all coming. And, this has been an agenda for a very long time by certain people and certain of these plutocrats to basically unravel America, once and for all, because they want to go to the next stage. And this next stage is a sort of super state where they control the whole population of the planet without borders. What certain people have called it a new world order, I like the label neoliberal world order. And this is all coming. So social strife in the United States on the macro level, the micro level of the United States is already a fact. This has been gradually building up for decades. It's just getting worse and worse, with American governments completely impotent to do anything about it. Exactly. And the ideologies and the talking points that you have amongst the majority of Americans themselves is not conducive to rectifying the problem. Most Americans have an allergy to the very word socialism or any kind of social welfare at all, although this would, on the surface of things, is what would save that country, just as it did during the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and also in the 1960s under Lyndon Baines Johnson with his great society programs.
Yeah.
But Americans have been brainwashed against these ideas. And then you have people who will call themselves libertarians who believe that all evil is in the government, but corporations are good. So let's get rid of government and let corporations run everything, from the pan into the, into the fire itself.
Yeah.
And so I don't see any light at the end of the tunnel for America itself.
Yeah.
But it is the rest of the world is at issue here because we don't have a third force or a third wave on this planet. A global political movement that is neither with the Atlantic bloc or with the Eurasianists, neither with America and Western imperialism or with the Russians and the Chinese. Something that is completely independent, that seeks the welfare of the people of this planet and seeks the welfare of the ecology and ecological balance of this planet. There is no movement. Eurasia is not going to do it. We can talk about Dugin, and the Russians and what they represent. These people are not the panacea. They are not the saviors. These people are the problem. They are fascists. They are racists. They are enslavers of humanity. People who fall into their trap are chumps. And there's been a lot of these people in the alternative media that since, especially 2016, because the Russians were paying a lot of these people as well, fell into the trap of the Dugin crowd. Now, Dugin himself, is just one figure. He is not, he is not the Antichrist. He is not the the great manipulator of things. He is just a rhetoric for hire and has been, as are the Russians themselves. The Russians, are, and Putin and that whole Putinist authoritarian state are just like everybody else. They are cynical corporatocrats. They're after to fill their pockets. They don't care about their own people, the Russian people. The Russian people are also suffering under the regime of Vladimir Putin. And these various characters like Alexander Dugin and whatnot who have prominence in that society. So it is time that people wake up and stop falling from one camp to another. They're playing this ping pong game between America and the East. The Ayatollah Khomeini, to his credit, I'm not a fan of his, but to his credit, I give the man his due, made a great statement. He said, neither East nor West. Not Sharq, not Garb. And this is a paradigm that any serious, conscientious human being who wants to see the betterment of this world needs to take on board. Neither East nor West.
Exactly. It's like what our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam teaches us, is that become one ummah. It's not any direction. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's in all directions. The ummah is in all directions. And basically the aspect of what people call Mother Earth and her beings and species, and just this whole overall ecological background and paradigm that we find ourselves in, is to take care of your world. It's like when I go to the park, I see trash all over the place. I see people not respecting each other. I feed my birds. And there was a woman that I had ran into, and people here are just hurt. They need people to understand them, talk to them. And I was able to give her good advice on how to find the peace of God inside your heart, within your heart. And we have a lot of these movements that exploit both men and women financially, sexually. So there is something that's going to happen next maybe 10 to 20 years, guaranteed, because it's the world and the people and the emotions and justice and evil. It's totally out of balance right now, including what's going to happen to the poor Hazara Shia community in Afghanistan, the women, the children. And people think it's funny, it's a joke. No, it's not a joke. You have to pray for them. You have to pray for them because there are bigger players because nothing happens without their permission. So whatever is happening because they want it to happen, whether they want to look America look bad, or now they're finishing up their time with America and moving on to a new host in terms of a global power. what anything is possible, and the human community have to listen to our great leaders in our community, such as Sheikh Wahid Azal, and listen to what he's telling you. Take heed to what he's telling you. He himself has, I thought I knew most of the things. I don't know anything. He has educated me so much on so many things in terms of, the people that I was dealing with and just talking to different people. Sometimes what appears to you on the surface, that it's not what it really seems. And I'm saying this on the record, that I'm grateful to our Sheikh who has educated me a lot, and I'm grateful for this path. And please
Very
continue.
welcome. It's my duty. It's my duty as your brother. We have a duty to the truth. It's not about us. We have to take people and always ensure that they're on the Sirat al-Mustaqim.
Yeah,
This is a duty that every person, conscientious, whatever you label it yourself as, has. So that is my duty as a one human being to another, to ensure that you know the truth. But this is also, as you probably have figured out, this is why I'm a threat to certain forces out there.
exactly.
And why they have gone out of their way, to try to besmirch my reputation, but they don't seem to be succeeding very well, because despite all the defamatory nonsense that they put on me on the internet, people still flock to me and they want to hear what I have to say.
Exactly.
So this says that their tactic is hollow. But where we are right now, people need to wake up and realize that what they're being told, whether from the mainstream media or also a lot of these portals of alternative media online, is a trap. And unfortunately, the internet and the whole cyberspace ecology is not getting better by the day. It's getting worse by the day, because there's a lot of censorship, by these big, by these big companies like Google, YouTube, etc.
Yeah.
And then when you go to places like the dark web, and I go to the dark web quite frequently, it's even worse. There's no censorship, but there you are completely inundated by information. So if you're looking for something, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack.
Right.
But you still get better unfiltered information in the dark web than you get on the normal internet. Normal internet is just newspeak, to use that phrase from Orwell. And this is bad. So I've cultivated networks of friendships with people all over the world. And I listen to these people because I think, information on the ground coming from people who are there, who, witnessing these events unfold, is generally more reliable than how it's filtered through the agendas of news corporations or governments or what have you. I think it is a good idea for especially the people from the global South, and even journalists, who are interested in truth and don't want to be beholden to the agendas of the news corporations that they're working for, to do this themselves, to cultivate friendships around the world with reliable people, and get them to give you information about what they're observing in these various places, what is unfolding, who are the actors, what are they hearing, and what are they feeling about the situation, what do they see? This is how real journalism used to be done. It's not being done like this anymore anywhere.
That's exactly right. And it's basically, you have laid it out in a very perfect manner on the truth about the Afghanistan situation, which you're not going to get this kind of info the way that you broke it down, and the history that you have put behind it, which are all facts that one can look up and verify for their own self. And it's telling you that there is a pattern of history repeating itself, like the aftermath of the Vietnam War. What they had envisioned, they didn't get that. Now that with the same thing we're going to see in Afghanistan. It looks good. It feels good. All the Muslim countries, basically, they're putting them through this illusion of looking good, feeling good, while at the same time, there's like a different paradigm that's coming up that they're totally unprepared for. And that's what Sheikh Wahid Azal is always gracing us with his presence and teaching us these things, to be mindful of it. It's for our own survival and for our own good if we take the time to heed these words from our elders.
Absolutely. Absolutely right. I think we should leave it there, because as far as Afghanistan is concerned, I think this is a mouthful for people to kind of sit back and reflect on, right now. And I think we should, at some point, next couple of weeks or whenever, do one, particularly on Dugan and these networks of Dugan
Please.
on the internet. I mean, the situation today, I should mention, is very different than it was in 2016. And they're not as omnipotent as they were back then. They were just out of control in 2016.
I remember YouTube and Facebook like 2015, 16, even going into 17. I never seen the type of like insanity that I saw on Facebook, on YouTube, in terms of anti-Islam, anti-anything, anti-immigrant. It was just so much nonsense that I was seeing going on. And now everything's kind of like quiet down. I don't see it as much as I used to, but that doesn't mean that they went away. They're still there.
No, they're still there. These forces are still there, and they're biding their time. We shall see what comes of all of this with them, particularly. But there's a saying, and it's a very interesting, astute observation. These sorts of forces, extremist forces especially, are always on the up, especially in the view of people and the people that they can garner to their side when they're in opposition.
Yeah.
The minute they take power and they show their true colors is when they're most vulnerable. The Trump years in some ways was a blessing in disguise, because for all this time, for 30, 40, 50 years, you'd had all these white supremacist neo-Nazi forces in America, in Europe, etc., clamoring on the fringes. All of a sudden, Trump comes, and the Russians and these big American contractors and plutocrats like the Mercer family poured all their money and their resources into getting Trump elected on the back of these sorts of forces, neo-Nazis, white supremacists, etc. Trump comes to the White House. What happens? The guy is an abject failure, a complete fool of a political figure, and ends up doing far worse than the Obama administration that he had criticized.
Exactly.
So he's discredited. So this is the silver lining I see, despite the fact that you had all these numbskulls back in 2020 still voting for this guy. It doesn't matter. Not that I'm saying that Joe Biden is any better. This entire system that we have, this duopoly is a problem.
Exactly.
But people who were politically astute, in my opinion, who still wanted to do their civic duty and vote, should have voted for third-party candidates. If you had all these people who were disenchanted with the system, whether on the side of the Democrats or the Republicans, they could have voted for the Green candidate, for example.
Exactly.
Imagine an election cycle where you had a vote, a massive surge of votes to a third-party candidate that suddenly got to that, that magic 270 number in the Electoral College. What would have completely, jolted that system worse than that? And you had a third-party candidate unexpectedly winning the American presidential election.
Exactly. And there's truth behind that, because even in Pakistan, when they had their last election in 2018, the leadership was always contested between these two families. It was either the Bhutto dynasty with their son and her husband and these other factors that were there, and it was the Nawaz Sharif family with the Sharifs. And then the third element was, of course, the army, who always has like their hand-picked puppets. So this guy, Imran Khan, he comes and he breaks their system, which caused a lot of chaos. And some good came out of it, but in other ways, he was incompetent, like Sheikh has pointed out. So here, it's possible too, if enough people come together, they can make a change. But again, it's like we said, the agenda is to put America on that sacrificial altar, like the post-Soviet war in Afghanistan, the same scenario that's going to be played out, which I would like Sheikh to conclude any thoughts that he might have to share with our audience.
I would say that for the people who are watching this and who have concerns, that I think it is the time that you start cultivating your own communities, because there is adversity coming, big ones. And so you need to be prepared. People need to band together, right? Create alternative communities so that you have networks of people. For example, if families run out of food, that you can supply food to families without it. If you have brothers or sisters that are homeless, you can provide temporary housing to these people. Brothers and sisters who are out of work, you can find them work. Create these alternative networks of communities now in spite of the system, because the system is unraveling, and it's going to unravel, and it's going to get a lot worse in North America before it gets better. So, people need to do this. Create your communities. It is together that you will weather this proverbial storm. And because the storm is there, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse and worse. And don't rely on your governments. Don't look up to your political leaders. The system itself is corrupt and it's falling apart. So you have no one but yourselves to rely upon. And together, you can do anything.
Thank you so much. And it reminds me of what it says in the Holy Quran, where it says, Allah only helps you when you help yourself. So when we decide to help ourselves and communities come and the Ummah decides to help itself, that's when the nur and the blessings will come upon all of us in a world that's suffering. So I thank Sheikh Wahid Azal, our beloved Sheikh and our brother and friend, and I give him permission also to use this video as he sees fit and upload it wherever he wishes, as we always have that love and truth between us on all accounts. So thank you all, everyone, and look forward to having Sheikh on back soon for part 5.
Okay.
Nur alaikum.
Alaikum nur.